Today's speaker is Michel Hockx. Michel did his undergraduate and graduate work at the University of Leiden and spent many years at the School of Oriental and African Studies, or as it's known now simply SOAS, a part of the University of London, the premier place for studying Asian work in the UK. He was, while he was there, a founding director of their China Institute. So it seems appropriate that he should come here to be the founding director of the Liu Institute for Asia and Asian Studies, which is, of course, now part of the Keough School for Global Affairs. His home department is East Asian Languages and Cultures in the College of Arts and Letters, and he is technically their professor of Chinese literature. He has published extraordinarily widely on modern Chinese literary communities. I was going to try counting up the number of articles, but I gave up at about 30 or so. But in addition, of course, there are innumerable articles that I can't even read the titles of since they're in Chinese. His first book was published in 1994, A Snowy Morning, 8 Chinese Poets on the Road to Modernity. And in 2003, he published a book on questions of style, literary societies and literary journals in modern China, 1911 to 37. And his most recent book, published in 2015, on internet literature in China, came out from Columbia University Press. His work covers those kinds of topics, but also how printed and digital publication works in relation to the state in China. And his work on censorship in China ranges from magazine censorship in the 1930s to the question he's going to explore today, present-day internet censorship in China, with the most wonderful cartoon image up there, and asking the question, is Winnie the Pooh banned in China? Please welcome Michel Hockx.
Well, good afternoon, and thank you very much for coming to listen to this talk. Can everybody hear me in the back? Yes? All right. So, for those of you who have a tailgate to go to, here's the 30-second version of the talk. Is Winnie the Pooh banned in China? No. So why is this even an issue? Well, the story starts here. In 2013, President Xi Jinping, who at that moment was a relatively new Chinese president and was, I believe, at the height of his popularity in China, certainly in his first year in office, he was so popular that the shops were selling sort of little dolls of him, and people, I had students coming to my office, students from China saying, "Oh, we love this president, he's wonderful." He was doing a lot about corruption, he was taking all kinds of measures that people really believed in, and he also seemed to be taken very seriously on the international stage. For instance, he visited the US in 2013, he met with President Obama, and more as sort of an expression of this popularity than anything else, people on the internet in China started to circulate this meme. And this was the beginning of a trend of internet memes being circulated, especially on a social media site called Weibo, which means microblog, in which Xi Jinping is represented as Winnie the Pooh. Now, over time, as Xi Jinping lost some of his popularity and started to implement very controversial policies, including making himself president for life, these memes started to take on more of a critical character. And there were times when comments on Xi Jinping's actions were restricted by Chinese censorship at very sensitive moments in time, which then sometimes also led to the censorship or partial censorship of images of Winnie the Pooh. And this all came to a sort of climax, one can say, in 2017, in July, when the the site Weibo that I mentioned earlier, the microblogging site in China, for about 23 minutes, made it impossible for people to search for the word Winnie the Pooh. And this has led to headlines like the following in our own media. China bans Winnie the Pooh. This is from The Guardian. Why China censors banned Winnie the Pooh. I don't know how you censor something that's banned, but anyway, that was from the BBC. China censors Winnie the Pooh on social media from the New York Times. Just last week, we at the Liu Institute, we had a lecture, a very interesting lecture about contemporary China. And the speaker, without thinking, I'm sure he didn't even do it on purpose, without thinking, just mentioned, when he was talking about censorship, he said, oh, and by the way, you can't search for Winnie the Pooh on the internet in China because it has been banned. So I tried searching for Winnie the Pooh on the internet in China on that Weibo site just yesterday. And of course, Winnie the Pooh is all over the place. And if you go to China, you will find Winnie the Pooh products in the stores. You will find people wearing Winnie the Pooh t-shirts. You will find lots of people interested in all kinds of Winnie the Pooh, right? So it is patently incorrect to say that Winnie the Pooh is banned in China. So this, in a nutshell, is the problem. On the one hand, we have a regime that practices censorship and that represses certain types of expression, especially political expression. On the other hand, we have reporting about these events in our media which oversimplify, exaggerate, and at times simply mistakenly identify what is going on. And I certainly do not want to blame our media. Someone asked me just now, are you going to talk about fake news? No, I'm not going to talk about fake news at all. Because it is very difficult for anyone in journalism, I think, to write without any type of bias about the phenomenon of censorship. Any journalists and any news organization has a vested interest in freedom of speech. And it is very difficult to write about something objectively if you have a strong vested interest in it. So I do not criticize our media for exaggerating the situation in China, but I do feel that we have to bear in mind that there is this vested interest. And it is the job of people like myself working in universities doing research to try and shed some light on what is actually happening. So I'm trying to walk this narrow path where I'm certainly not making excuses for the censorship, but I also want to tell you that the situation is more complex than it is usually presented. Just last month, in August of this year, this item appeared in the news. Again, I'm using the BBC as my favorite scapegoat here, because it is known for its normally very unbiased reporting. The item that was in the news was that Google, which, as you may know, is in fact largely banned in China, was preparing a special version of its search engine to be introduced to the Chinese market. And this special version of its search engine would accommodate certain restrictions that the Chinese government imposes on search engines. And the BBC, in its reporting about that, and this was copied by several other Western news organizations, had the following quote. It said, "This new search app that Google is preparing would block search terms like human rights and religion." And a BBC reporter who was interviewed on NPR also talked about this and said, well, as you know, people in China cannot search for words like human rights and religion, and Google is going to do the same thing. So once again, here's a search for human rights on the Weibo website, which I did yesterday. Interesting here especially is that the United Nations has an official Weibo account where it actually writes about the work of the UN Human Rights Committee. And here's a search for religion on Baidu, which is the largest search engine in China. So once again, the suggestion that Chinese people cannot even search for words like religion and human rights is utterly wrong, and it's not helpful if we want to critique the censorship and the system that underlies it. It is not helpful if our criticism is expressed on the basis of facts that are wrong. Right? So it's very important to get things right when it comes to censorship. Here's another example of things that sometimes surprise people. This is a list of the most visited websites in China, according to Alexa.com, which is a Western organization, a commercial organization that ranks websites according to the number of people visiting them in different countries. So globally, the three websites that are visited most often are Google, YouTube, and Facebook. Now, as everybody who's been to China will tell you, Google, YouTube, and Facebook, and also Twitter are officially not accessible in China. However, on this list of Alexa's own list of the most visited websites in China, we see that Google appears as number 11 and YouTube as number 12. So although Google is not as popular as the Baidu search engine, it is still attractive enough for people in China to want to find ways to connect to it, even though officially that is not possible. The same goes for YouTube. Interesting is that Facebook is entirely absent in this equation, either because it is more efficiently blocked or because people feel that sites like Weibo actually provide them with a sufficient alternative aimed at Chinese language users, and therefore they don't need Facebook. I don't know which is the more important factor. So what's going on here? Well, let's look at how the internet censorship actually works. For those of you who are familiar with this, I'm obviously not a computer scientist, but these are the three main methods of censorship. The first one, the one that, if you've read about this in the media, you're probably all familiar with, is the firewall. People sometimes talk about the Great Firewall of China as a metaphor for the censorship in China. So the firewall is the blunt instrument. It is basically a list of websites, technically a list of IP addresses, that if you're in China, you cannot go to. So an example of that would be 3,000 IP addresses associated with google.com or its various versions in different countries. So it's a blunt instrument because anyone who can access the internet through what is known as a virtual private network or VPN can circumvent the firewall and can actually access the sites on that list. And that is why Google and YouTube appear as the 11th and 12th most popular website accessed by users in China, because the firewall is not a very high wall and not one that's very difficult to climb. So that's the blunt instrument that's mainly aimed at people who are not very computer literate, who don't know how, and who have no desire to go beyond the firewall, and therefore it keeps them from accidentally accessing things that the government doesn't want them to see. Second on the list is the content filter. If you are connected to a particular network, say through a particular internet provider, the internet provider can install filters so that you cannot download content that contains particular keywords. So that's a way of That's a slightly less blunt instrument because you are actually accessing some of the blocked websites. Say if CNN were blocked through the firewall, you wouldn't be able to access all of CNN. But if CNN were allowed, but there were certain pages on CNN that had certain keywords that the government doesn't want you to read about, then those pages would be filtered out, theoretically. So that's a slightly less blunt instrument. The most sophisticated instrument and the most useful, well, effective one, is the search engine filter. Because after all, these days, if you use the internet, 99.9% of the time, you go through a search engine. You go through Google or something else. And if the search engine doesn't show you something, then for all practical purposes, it doesn't exist. It's very difficult to find a resource on the internet without the help of a search engine, unless you know the exact address. So if a search engine can be made to overlook or not report certain search results, then that can be a very efficient way of giving people the impression that they're actually finding what they're looking for, but things have been left out. So I'll show you an example of that. So this slide and the next slide will have two screenshots. Both of them are from my own computer. This one, I was using my normal internet connection. I accessed the Yahoo search engine, and I searched for Tiananmen Square massacre, the massacre of students and civilians in Beijing on Tiananmen Square and the area around Tiananmen Square in 1989. And if you search for that from a computer in a room in a house in South Bend through the Yahoo website, and you do an image search, then you find images like this. Basically, Tank Man and various variations on Tank Man, protesting students, a lot of evidence, photographic evidence of the events of the night between June the 3rd and June the 4th, 1989. I then connected to my virtual private network, which I talked about earlier, which you normally use when you're in China to try and pretend you're somewhere else. So I was using it the other way around. I was using it to pretend I was actually in China. So I turned my computer in South Bend into a computer that pretended to be in China. And I went to Yahoo again. Yahoo then came up with these results. Same search, same website. The only difference is the presumed location of my computer. So Yahoo, unlike Google, accepts the fact that if they want to be active on the Chinese market, if they want to serve Chinese customers, they have to filter out certain search results. And they do so in order to be able to conduct business legally in China. So this is an extreme example, but I think it's also a very clear example of the sophistication of these kind of filters. Because I wasn't in China, so I could make this comparison. But if you're in China and you're using one of these search engines, you simply do not know that what you see is not all that is out there. So when we talk about censorship in China, we're not talking about a blunt instrument most of the time. So this cartoon, which seems to suggest that censorship is just about one person knocking someone else over the head, imposing the words that they speak onto someone who wants to speak different words. I mean, that's not how it works in China. It's very important to bear that in mind. There's a lot of misunderstanding based on images we have, especially those of us who are old enough to remember the Cold War and the Soviet Union. There's a lot of misunderstanding about how the censorship and the system works in China. is not an almighty party simply not allowing people access to anything. It's actually much more sophisticated than that. So in the research that I'm doing, I've done a lot of research on case studies of censorship, but I'm now trying to develop a more general project on censorship, working with students. And we're starting at the very beginning. We're starting to ask very fundamental questions, such as, what is censorship? Is censorship the restriction of public expression? So not allowing people to say certain things. Or is censorship the restriction of access to information? So the search engine that doesn't allow you to see the things you want to see. Or is it maybe both of these things? And if so, what's the connection? Does censorship occur only under authoritarian regimes? Is it only political? Can it perhaps also take place under the control of military institutions or under the control of religious institutions? To what extent is censorship different from things like taboo or things like just not wanting to say things because it doesn't seem the right thing to say? These questions are sometimes very difficult to answer. Does censorship have to be something that applies to all citizens or something that can also apply to specific groups? In the UK, for instance, we have the Film Censorship Board, which decides which films, which movies can be viewed by people who are over 18, which movies can be viewed by people who are over 12, and so on. And this is referred to as censorship as well. So there are all kinds of questions once you start getting into the research about what censorship actually is. So we're gathering definitions that scholars over the years have put forward, and they often fall somewhere within the context of these four questions. How do we study censorship? Censorship is probably one of the hardest things to study, I say, because I want to impress you. Because if it's done really well, you can't tell that it's been done. See what I mean, right? So really good censorship gives you something and you don't even know it's been censored. Also, censorship is something that a lot of people have very strong feelings about. As we saw, also our own media tend to exaggerate it or not be very well informed about it because of vested interests they have in not wanting to see censorship occur. So it's very difficult to find anyone you can talk to when you study censorship who will give you a sort of an unbiased response as to, well, this is how it works, or this is what happened. Therefore, the question is, how do you study that? Well, I think the most common way of studying it is in the context of, especially in political science, the study of authoritarian regimes. So in the case of China, about 50 to 60% of the research done here in the US about the Chinese internet is in fact research done by people who are interested in censorship and who are interested in the question whether or not China will ever become a democracy. So now there's a lot of other things happening on the internet in China, which I will tell you about, which don't get a lot of attention, because that question seems to be so crucial. So there's a lot of research that studies censorship by looking at it as part of a repressive system and the resistance to that system. So something like Winnie the Pooh becoming an emblem of political resistance is, something of great interest to not just to our media, but also to many scholars. If you think Winnie the Pooh is the most extreme example, at some point it was also reported that China had banned the letter N. And I'll be happy to take questions about that one as well. Another way to study censorship is to document it as best as you can. which isn't easy, but you can look at different versions of things that have been published. You can sometimes, if you're working on literature as I do, you can try and find different versions of a manuscript, of a printed edition of something. You can sometimes, over time, you can find out what the uncensored version was of something that was censored, and then you can compare that. So you can try to document yourself as best you can. When I studied internet literature, I also decided to interview one of the censors just to figure out what he thought that he was doing. Some people would argue that that's ethically perhaps problematic, but I felt that it was something I needed to do. An interesting way of studying censorship is the emphasis on transactions. This is where it becomes very cynical. In China and probably everywhere else in the world where censorship is present, censors are not just outside forces that put their foot on something and press it down, or that remove something and throw it away. There's often a lot of interaction and negotiation between the censors and the people that are being censored. Two small examples from my own research. In the 1930s in China, this is from before communism in China, in the 1930s, there was also censorship in China, and there was one censor who was about to ban a publication by a literary publisher. But this censor was himself, in his spare time, also a writer. So he went to the publisher and he said, well, I'm about to ban this book that you're going to publish. But I'm a writer as well, and I have a book that I would like to publish. And maybe you could publish that for me in this famous series that you have. And the publisher said, well, I will consider publishing your book, but not in that series. You're not that good. Right? So that's the negotiation. And then the censor said, well, okay, but then you do have to do it in hardback and not in paperback, because otherwise we have no deal. Then the publisher said, okay, deal, we'll publish this book in hardback. So it took me about 5 years to find a copy of that book in a library in China, and I begged the librarian to show it to me. I said, I don't even want to touch it, I don't even want to read it, I just want to see if it's a hardback or a paperback documentation. And it turned out to be a hardback, so the story was true. An even more cynical story, which I'm not sure if it's true, recently, maybe 10 years ago, when it was very popular here in the West to publish English translations of Chinese novels with the word banned in China on the cover. It is rumored to have happened that a very well-known Chinese novelist actually bribed a censor to ban his novel in China so that he could sell the translation rights. And okay, so this is the kind of cynicism that you need to be wary of as well. The productive approach, and I put that in quotation marks, but it's a very interesting new approach when people are saying, well, censorship events and censorship incidents, they actually also produce a lot of culture. So things don't just get banned. Often there's a lot of debate about it, there's a lot of discussion about it, and it can have all kinds of unexpected consequences within the sort of cultural context. So censorship, while destroying one thing, it can also produce something else. And I'll conclude for the last few minutes by giving you an example of the something else. Because if there's one thing I hope you will take home from this, is that there's a lot of things happening on the internet in China that have nothing to do with censorship. So again, we may have the impression that this is a very tightly controlled space where nothing interesting can happen. That is not true. We focus a lot in our research on the things that are not allowed on the internet in China, but the things that are allowed can also be very interesting. For instance, if you look at how people in China actually use the internet, you'd be surprised at how few scholars actually look at that. Most scholars look at what people are not allowed to do on the internet in China. If you look at what people are actually doing, they do a lot of things we do as well: music, news, video games. Online literature, 39.5%. And in 2014, online literature, 45.3%. In 2013, 44.4%. So there's a lot of people going online in China to read literature. This is very unusual. I can't think of any other country where online literature is up there with online banking and online payment and online shopping in terms of what people actually want to do when they go online. Certainly not the case in the US. I don't think there's even such a category in the US. And this is an interesting, unexpected side effect of censorship. Printed books in China are controlled very strictly in terms of who publishes them and what you need to do in order to get them published. So when the internet came about, a lot of people who were interested in storytelling, writing, especially popular literature, popular fiction, went online and started on websites like this one, started to serialize fiction. We're not talking sort of avant-garde fiction, we're talking romance fiction, martial arts fiction, things like that. And started to produce these really, really long novels that people could subscribe to and they could read them, new chapters coming out on a daily basis. And this website, Xidian, at some point was among the top 100 most frequently visited websites in the world, which is a huge number of users. So because of the strict control of printed books, it actually happened that on the internet, people started to print commercial books that had not gone through the official approval process, that did not have ISBN numbers. The ISBN number in China is a censorship mechanism. On the internet, people could just publish books without having gone through that process. And this took the censors completely by surprise. It's like, oh my God. And there was nothing necessarily political about it, but it was out of their control. There were millions of books being published on the internet, and they didn't have control over them. So in my research on internet literature, I talk about how they sort of come to terms with controlling at least part of that production because they want to bring it into their system. And one of the reasons they wanted to control it is because so much of the fiction published on these websites was erotic. So this is a blacklist of the 10 most pornographic websites in China in 2011, and they're all literary websites, which if you were to do that in the US, I don't think you would. The top 10 most pornographic websites in the US are not literary websites. Right? Now, I would love to tell you more about that, but Peter Holland has banned me from talking about pornography, so censorship in action here as well. So I'll leave it at that. I hope I've given you some sort of approaches to thinking about censorship in China with more nuance and more complexity without necessarily changing your view on the phenomenon as such. And I hope I've shown you that also from a perspective of how we study here and how we teach. This is a very interesting thing to look at, both in China and elsewhere. So I'll leave it at that, and I look forward to your questions. Thank you very much.
What do the universities think of the censorship?
Well, they don't like it at all. And it's, I'll tell you a story. I went to China last year, and I was asked to give a lecture at Peking University. And my lecture was about Xi Jinping's cultural policy. Right? So Xi Jinping has given speeches about literature and art and how it fits into the socialist system. So, and that lecture was arranged months prior. And all of a sudden, it turned out that on the very same day that I was going to give that lecture, that was also going to be the opening day of the Communist Party Congress, which is a very sensitive period in China. So, and I said to them, well, should I just not give this lecture about Xi Jinping on the first day of the party Congress? And they said, well, no, it's okay, but it's just, us and the graduate students. And so, as one professor put it to me once, when you teach graduate students at university, you can say anything you want. If you teach undergraduates, you have to cut out maybe 10%. No, if you teach master students, you cut out 10%. If you teach undergraduates, you cut out another 20%. If you talk to the media, there's hardly anything left to say. Right? So universities, are relatively speaking, have more space for debate and freedom of expression, but it's certainly has been under attack in recent years as well. Yeah. Yes.
You raised the question, excuse me, you raised the question of whether or not censorship exists in non-authoritarian regimes. And then you gave several examples. Have you considered the concept of censorship in academia?
Yes. And I believe that, well, it certainly exists in China in academia. In the US, so then it depends on your definition of censorship. Yes, so I feel, as far as I know, as an academic in the US, I'm allowed to write and say whatever I want. Whether or not it gets published is another matter. I'm not aware of any policies as such that restrict my academic freedom. But I sense that you have a counter-example.
Of speech
Right.
in academia by conservatives,
Right.
by white supremacists,
Right.
by KKK, and other people that may not be.
So, well, the way I've been trained, I was told that it should be possible for academics within a university environment to take up provocative positions, because this is part of what we do. We test ideas, and sometimes what we say might be shocking or provocative. What we cannot do, because is to produce speech that is aimed at engendering hatred towards particular communities or violence towards particular communities. So, and for me, that is where I draw the line, and you could refer to that as censorship if you have a very extreme definition of freedom of speech, but I think it should make sense. So I think a lot of these discussions about censorship the question is not so much, does censorship exist or not? I think the question is censorship supported by a sort of broad social consensus? Do people actually generally agree with it? You know, again, I don't want to talk too much about pornography, but I think that's a kind of censorship where a lot of people agree that there are certain types of that kind of culture that need to be controlled. And most countries would agree with that. And when China censors that kind of material, the West doesn't really comment on that. Right? So I think the question is more, is the censorship based on a social consensus or not? Does that answer your question? Yeah, thank you. Yes.
What about social acquiescence in China of censorship of the internet? Is there, do you perceive some level of acquiescence
Yes.
among ordinary Chinese?
Yes. There's something called the cute cat theory. The cute cat theory. In internet studies, and that is that the last vast majority of people who use the internet use it to do things like posting pictures of their cats. So as long as you can do that, as long as you can post pictures of your cats, and in China pictures of your food, then you're fine. And then, so it's not even acquiescence, it's just that you can do all the things that you want to do, and there's no desire to explore things beyond that. So, and I think that's sort of a serious issue sometimes when it comes to the way we study censorship in China. That sometimes, not always, but sometimes it seems as if we expect that Chinese people should want to have certain opinions or should want to read certain things because we feel that that's what they should be doing. But, and sometimes we forget that, of course, Chinese people have their own opinions. And so that's another one of those situations where, on the one hand, it's clear that certain things are just repressed in China. On the other hand, sometimes we assume too quickly that if only there was no censorship, Chinese people would all want to be like us or read the things we're reading, and I think that's probably not true either.
But we do read about the Chinese students that are still upset about some of the censorship. If a Chinese student wanted to publish a dissertation on the real Tiananmen Square, put it out there, would it be shut down ultimately?
Yes. I think anything to do with 1989 Tiananmen Square is, I mean, recently there's been upset about the fact that Peking University has a Marxism society, and they'd gotten really involved in sort of supporting sort of local workers, and so the government got upset about that, and so the communist government is trying to shut down the Peking University Marxism Society for being too Marxist. Right? So there's all kinds of limitations for sure. Yeah.
What's the difference between mainland China's censorship and Hong Kong, or is there any between mainland and Hong Kong?
So Hong Kong, originally before the handover, so the Hong Kong system was very similar to the British system. So if there was censorship, it would be more towards things like obscenity and pornography. Political censorship was very, very limited. I think what you're starting to see now in China is in Hong Kong is that there's some pressure from the mainland sometimes to suppress political expression that they see as undermining the security of, I mean, that's always the undermining the security of the nation. Right? So, but China is not yet in a position to impose that through legal means. I mean, the Hong Kong legal system is still pretty independent, right? But so it's imposing it through what I would call illegal means by arresting booksellers, and you know, that was a story that was much reported on. So, and I think that's why the situation in China is becoming worrying in recent years, because there's so much happening sort of outside what even in the Chinese legal system should be allowed. So a lot of things are just happening, you know, I would say illegally, people being arrested, taken away, detained beyond, you know, any sort of reasonable amount of time. So, so some of these things have happened in Hong Kong as well. Yeah. Yes.
China sends some of their best and brightest to universities like Notre Dame, and obviously, while they're at Notre Dame, they're not under the censorship of China, and then they return. And I think that's in large numbers of people. So really, how effective is it once people are not under that censorship and then return?
I think, you know, any kind of exposure to other parts of the world is always going to be useful. I mean, for me, it's been useful to live in China for a certain period of time, and I, you know, we have wonderful students from China here, and they're not afraid to sort of speak up in class, and also sometimes to sort of point out our own biases and to, you know, show us some of the opinions from a Chinese perspective, right? And I think that's really important. I think the moment we start to associate everything a Chinese person says with having been brainwashed or having been censored, I think then we're definitely going in the wrong direction. Then we're sort of going back to sort of Cold War kind of mentalities, right? So there's an awful lot of stuff out there in China that's not censored. There's a lot of information available. People can read about what's happening in the world. The number of things that are censored, the number of topics that are censored is relatively limited, right? So, random example, when the Iraq War was taking place, some of my colleagues in political science were actually reading the Chinese newspapers to get an unbiased perspective. So there are lots of things happening in the world where someone in China would have a very informed perspective on, but then there's some things where simply they've never been given the information. So something like 1989, unless that story has been passed on through families and friends, I mean, it's very difficult to find information about that in China itself. So to answer your question, I think that, you know, with so many Chinese students studying abroad, they will become global citizens and they will go back to China, and some of them will work for the government and some of them will not work for the government, but in the end I think that, they will bring change. Whether or not it's the change we hope to see, we'll have to wait and see. George.
What about control or censorship of history books in schools?
Yes.
I read recently that also private schools in China are now required to submit all those reading materials they use in their schools.
Yes, so censorship of in education has become stricter in recent years under Xi Jinping. I mean, this is one of the areas where I think China has gone backwards under Xi Jinping when it comes to authoritarianism. And it's a shame because I don't think that was necessary. But so there is a lot of emphasis now on telling the story of China in a Chinese voice based on what, Chinese people think, not introducing any Western textbooks or Western ideas. It's not always effective. I mean, it's not the case that every university immediately abolishes all its Western textbooks, but it's certainly, but if you go below universities to secondary schools, primary schools, certainly the patriotic education has been ongoing since the 1990s, and I think it's only becoming stronger. There's nothing wrong with patriotism, but it's, sometimes it does go very far. Jonathan.
Does the Chinese government ever discuss Western censorship or ideas such as something like evolution or something like that?
They certainly discuss Western bias and that's why I point these things out, because I think we're sort of shooting ourselves, if we now meaning the West, right? We're shooting ourselves in the foot if we report on Chinese censorship and we get the facts wrong, right? So, you can imagine, and we have Chinese students in the room. I think you can imagine if you were to walk up to people and say, "Oh, your country bans Winnie the Pooh." It's like, well, why would I even take you seriously? Right? So Chinese media are often quick to point out some of these biases and mistakes in Western media, for sure. Censorship. I don't know. I mean, but there's definitely, China does comment on human rights situations in the US and other countries. I simply don't know whether or not there's Chinese reports about censorship in Western countries, but there might be. Yeah.
With all this conversation about censorship on specifically the internet,
Yeah.
that does bring up the point, what is the general global guidelines for freedom of the internet? And where does that line get drawn? Because there's not like a global First Amendment, for example, on the internet in the modern age, because it's just too new in that regard.
Yeah.
So where does the global community stand on this? And what, if any, exists to kind of say there needs to be a freedom of the internet?
So I think the global community, so there are other countries that censor the internet very strictly and more strictly than China, Iran, Saudi Arabia, and there are other examples as well. So, but in countries where there is no explicit state censorship of the internet, I think the assumption in the beginning was that this would be a very free environment, the information superhighway and things like that, and that it would censor itself, which most of the time it does. I mean, so Facebook has its community standards, Twitter has its community standards, and they're not exactly the same, but they're by and large sort of similar. And again, they try to filter out things like obscenity, pornography, terrorist manuals, things like, I mean, there's a sort of range of topics that I think people tend to agree on should be sort of not be included. But it's, I think the mood is changing. I think in many Western countries there's discussion now about, well, is the internet really such a positive, sort of free environment, or is it actually becoming a very dangerous environment? So that's where fake news comes in, that's where social media bullying comes in, and all kinds of other things where hacking, stealing of information, influencing elections in foreign countries. I mean, so all of a sudden there's this discussion about the internet where we're saying, well, maybe we should be able to control this. Maybe we should install filters. Maybe we should have firewalls. Maybe we should have, so Western countries are sort of thinking about some of these same technologies that China is using. And let's not forget the technology that China uses, especially the hardware, is often actually made in Silicon Valley, right? So it's just they're applying it for different purposes than we're applying it for. Yes.
Does the government ever censor on behalf of a corporation or to support a company within, like Alibaba? Like if there was a negative news story about Alibaba, would they say censor that story? Or
so that's the interaction, right? That's the negotiation. So officially they would not, but I think cynics would say, well, one of the reasons why Google is banned in China is, and Facebook is because it takes out a very powerful competitor for Chinese companies like Sohu and Weibo, etc. Well, Sina, which owns many of these social media things. So, and the economic elite and the political elite in China are intertwined, and so some of the restrictions, I think, are also have a commercial nature. For instance, and this is sort of goes beyond the internet. There are people in the room who know more about it, but when it comes to Hollywood films, for instance, China only imports, I think, 34 Hollywood films per year, and that's partly because of just not wanting to have the competition, too strong a competition with the local film industry. So, so officially they would never censor something. Well, officially, we rarely know what exactly is censored, right? So there are general guidelines that, well, we don't want to see this, this, and this on the internet. And you rarely get to see the actual list of words or something like that, right? So, and the system in part also relies very heavily on editors and internet service providers to sort of guess what they can and cannot do. And sometimes they guess wrong and sometimes they guess right. And most of the time they just err on the side of caution. And people have done experiments where they sort of wrote 10 stories on sensitive topics in Chinese and submitted them to 10 different websites. And none of them got banned on every single website. Right? There was always one that would take the risk and one that wouldn't. So it's not sort of very clear cut. Some things are clear cut. I mean, Tiananmen Massacre, that's, it's very difficult to get away with that. And there are 2 or 3 other topics like that. Yeah. Peter.
I have to ask, because nobody else has yet, how on earth did the story emerge that China banned the letter N?
Because when Xi Jinping was going for being president for life, so abolishing term limits on the presidency, some people, I think, were sort of sending posts to social media where something like N becomes infinity, N meaning the number, right? So again, for a very short while, anything that had the letter N in it was banned. Of course, when you write in Chinese, you don't necessarily need to use it. So it sounds much worse in English, right? Oh, China bans the letter N, right? But let's not forget China writes in Chinese, right? So if you had the letter N somewhere in between the Chinese characters for a very short period of time, there seemed to be action against that. I mean, but it's never more than a few minutes, and then someone realizes, well, this is truly ridiculous. And that's the one sort of takeaway I got from when I interviewed a censor. And he got really upset, and he said, you Western people, you think we're crazy, right? You think that we don't allow people to say this word or that word, and don't you think we realize that people might say positive things about our president or positive things about... We're never going to just ban a word, right? We're actually going to read things before we decide whether or not to ban it. And that is where the problem lies, because try reading everything that appears on the internet. It's impossible.
An extraordinarily fascinating talk.
Thank you
very much indeed.
Thank you.